Okay, welcome to our third class in this last section of Shantideva's text, the second part of chapter 9 that we're going through. Let's go ahead and start with a few prayers as usual. Let me pull that up on the screen, and we'll begin with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. We'll do the short mandala offering prayer, again with the visualization of making a vast pure offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And finally, refuge in bodhicitta before the teaching, first in English and then the next 2 times in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chunyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog. Let's do a short meditation to calm the mind a bit, using the breath as your meditation object. Just work with the breath in silence for the first few minutes. And then after that, I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection so we can set our bodhicitta motivation together for tonight. Okay, so we'll begin. So now let's set our motivation for tonight. We can recall in last week's teaching when we were examining feelings that there is this effort that we make in our lives, chasing after the pleasant feelings, trying to avoid the unpleasant ones. And when neutral feelings arise, we more or less have kind of a mind of dullness with regard to those. And all of this is rooted in our belief that these feelings inherently exist. And also, of course, the belief that we ourselves inherently exist, the being who is chasing after these feelings, avoiding others, and so on. So we put all of this effort into acquiring the good feelings and avoiding the bad ones. And for what purpose? When we come to understand that the self doesn't exist in the way it appears, these feelings do not exist in the way they appear. In fact, nothing exists in the way that it appears. Then we can recognize that it's better to put effort into realizing that truth, being free from this hallucination that we are buying into. And of course, that ignorance that is grasping at that hallucination as if it were real. So we can begin with setting our motivation to want to have this wisdom in our own mind so that we can be free once and for all from our patterns of suffering that we get caught up in on the basis of this ignorance, grasping at false appearances. But when we see that other beings are under the control of these same factors, when we see how they are bound up in their own feelings, and not even having a clue as to how things actually exist, they don't have the good fortune that we possess of having met with the teachings on emptiness as we're discussing in this course. So it should break our hearts that these beings are needlessly suffering. If they only knew the truth, they could be free from suffering once and for all. Wouldn't be caught up in all of the illusion that they are buying into. So set the motivation that includes their welfare, the mind of bodhicitta that thinks that you're here to develop your own qualities, your own understanding, so that you then can be a benefit to others, having perfected the wisdom within your own mind as well as all the other qualities. You then can help others most skillfully. And this is our goal, our reason for being here tonight. Okay, so again, in last week's class, as I said, we were working with feelings and the close placement of mindfulness on feelings. Recall that again for the Bodhisattva. These are specific meditations to engage in realizing the lack of inherent existence of these phenomena, beginning with the body, which of course is the coarsest thing that we are very attached to, and we want to make sure that we uproot any delusions that we have about the inherent existence of the body. But those who use these close placements of mindfulness, who want to examine the conventional nature of things, can also examine the nature of the body as suffering, that it is not a perfect vehicle, that it is subject to suffering and has unattractive qualities and so on. And then, of course, with feelings, we can see that they are part of the cause of our suffering. That going chasing after those feelings doesn't result in any real lasting peace or happiness. And in that way, we can use a meditation on feelings to accentuate the true origins of our suffering. But nonetheless, we could also look at the empty nature of the feelings, which is what Master Shantideva is doing in this text. So let's get back into the slides and the content that we were looking at last session. We are going to start from verse 98, but I will revisit 97, and that's because They're both in the same outline. There also was a question that came up about 97 in the discussion before class that I want to answer as best as I can. So recall that we are in the section of explaining the reasoning, establishing emptiness that pertains to selflessness of phenomena. Selflessness of persons we discussed in the last course at the tail end of that. Now we're looking at phenomena other than persons. So while these phenomena that we're examining, the body, feelings, mind, the other phenomena includes the various mental factors we have. All of that are part of the basis for a person, but they are not the person, of course. Those phenomena also lack inherent existence. So again, we are in the first section of this where we're explaining the selflessness phenomena by way of the four close placements of mindfulness. And that, of course, as I said, is divided into these four. So we're in the section on feelings. So the meditation on feelings, we're in this section now that is called refuting that the cause, let me go to the right page of the outline here, refuting that the cause exists inherently. Having refuted that the nature of feelings is not inherent, because if suffering, for example, was an inherent feeling, then we could never experience happiness. And if happiness was an inherent feeling, then we would always experience it and never be subject to suffering. But now we're looking at the cause, and the main cause for feeling as a mental factor is the other mental factor, which we call contact. And contact is what happens when three things aggregate. The three things are the consciousness that needs to be there, of course, for that experience, the sense power that empowers you to then know the object, and then the object itself. So all three of those aggregate and come together, and that is the foundation for feeling. So again, the question had to do with this idea of, can a material object appear to a non-material phenomenon? So in other words, can a material object like the color blue or the taste of honey, can these things appear and be directly known by our consciousness, the various consciousnesses that we have that are sensory consciousnesses related to each of those? Well, this is why, in my estimation, again, when we talk about it conventionally, but I do think that His Holiness's point and the way it's presented here has to do with the ultimate analysis. But when we look at it conventionally, that's what the sense power is all about in terms of the physical sense powers, is because there needs to be some sort of a bridge to allow our consciousness to manifest in a way so that through the eye sense power, it can then know the color blue. And through the nose sense power, or I'm sorry, tongue sense power, it can then know the taste of honey. If we don't have the sense power operating, then we are not capable of that consciousness manifesting. And that's because there is a bit of a bridge, if you will, that occurs with the what they call the uncommon empowering condition of the five sense powers that are physical. Those are the five things that empower these five consciousnesses to know their respective objects. That's why they're called uncommon empowering conditions, is because your eye sense power doesn't know the taste of honey or the smell of newly mown grass or whatever the case might be. And your ear consciousness doesn't know the color blue and doesn't know, tactile sensation. And all these various things are unique to their specific objects. So when we bring those three together, a consciousness that acts as sort of the screen upon which all of this is happening, which then manifests in the form of an eye consciousness, the eye sense power that empowers that to know its respective objects, and then the visual form, the shape or color that then is appearing to that eye sense power. So this is why, again, in Buddhist terms, we would identify those five sense powers as being a key part of the process. Without them being active, our consciousnesses are incapable of knowing physical objects. So again, that's how I understand everything to work. Now, when His Holiness says that, let me actually I went and pulled up my Kindle on here. Let me see if I can share the passage that was being talked about particularly. I think I have to make this a little bit larger. Let's see, there we go. So we have, this was the previous page that it started here, verse 97. Even just before that, it says, not only that, at the bottom of the page there, Shantideva continues, but also since consciousness is immaterial, how can we define it with the word contact, which relates to matter. What can come into contact with consciousness? This was the question that gave rise to the discussion group query. So then we get to the actual verse where it says the consciousness is immaterial, and so one cannot speak of contact with it. A combination too has no reality, and this we have already demonstrated. I think what we're talking about in verse 96 there about consciousness being immaterial, His Holiness even explains that in the bottom. Who could be harmed by painful experiences, since there is no such thing as intrinsically and absolutely existing painful sensations? Therefore, by examining contact, the cause of sensation, and by examining the nature of sensation itself, we find no intrinsically real sensation or feeling. The conclusion is that these exist only in dependence on other factors, and that nothing whatsoever can exist independently and intrinsically. So I really feel like what he's pointing out is that you cannot have inherent contact existing with an inherent object, an inherent sense power, an inherent consciousness, because that would belie everything having a causal relationship, those three things coming together. So when His Holiness makes that statement, it's hard for me to discern. I think he could be talking about, again, in a conventional way, that consciousness needs to have some other factor to know its material objects. But nonetheless, it's also speaking to the fact that if there is no inherently existent object, no inherently existent sense power, no inherently existent consciousness, well then, how can that ever occur? How can matter ever come into contact with consciousness? Because we do see that argument being put forward in this section, that things cannot come into contact or act as causes for each other if there is inherent existence involved. Inherent existence means that things have independent existence. That means that a consciousness apprehending blue, I consciousness knowing blue, would arise without either of those other factors being involved. You wouldn't even need the blue. You wouldn't need the sense power of the eye that would allow you to see that, because things would exist independently, intrinsically. So I think it gets to be a little confusing in this commentary sometimes, because it's very difficult to know, is he talking about things conventionally? Is he talking about things ultimately? I tend to lean on the side of ultimately, because there is an explanation for how eye consciousnesses arise. How they arise in relation to an object blue is through the medium of the eye sense power, because the eye sense power is what allows that blue to be known. Now, again, in modern science, we would probably define it in terms of all the various parts of the eye and the retina and all of the things that go on with the optic nerve. And that's what allows the brain to process something that it sees as color and what have you, and to know it. But again, these things are all, regardless of whether it's that scientific explanation or the Buddhist explanation that these sense powers are subtle, clear matter that can be seen by clairvoyance and so on. Regardless of the explanation, we see that there's a causal process and there are factors involved. Those conditions and causes fly right in the face of inherent existence, because we can't have anything like inherently existent contact, because it is an aggregation of three things coming together and those things needing to be there. So I think it's the best I can do in explaining that. But let's go on to verse 97, which was where the question in the homework was coming up in terms of that particular verse. Thus, if contact does not exist, then from what would feelings arise? For the sake of what is there this fatigue? Due to what would what be damaged? So the idea is that if we find that contact does not exist inherently, again, we always have to use that modifier when we're talking about this section on wisdom, then from what would feelings arise? If it doesn't exist inherently, then how could you get inherently existent feelings? This is the whole proof that we're going through here, is we're proving that there are no inherently existent feelings because there isn't an inherently existent cause of feelings, the contact. Then that last part, for the sake of what is there this fatigue? I mean, we, as I said in the motivation tonight, we engage in so much chasing after these feelings as if they were intrinsically existent, with that false belief that they are, and with the false belief that we ourselves are. And what is giving harm to whom, or to do to what would what be damaged? The idea being that, again, There's no real intrinsic nature to any of these things. So we're not really receiving harm from suffering feelings or whatever the case might be in an intrinsic way. But nonetheless, these things do exist. Harmful feelings exist, pleasant feelings exist, contact exists. All of these phenomena exist. They just don't exist in the false way that we are adhering to them. So let's go on to 98, which again was in that same section. When there is no one who feels, and feelings also do not exist, because we're proving that they don't exist because their cause contact doesn't exist inherently. So when we see that none of these exist inherently, having seen this situation at that time, why would you not turn away from craving? If we really get the import of this, if we see that none of these things inherently exist, then craving doesn't make any sense, right? Craving has no foundation because there's no inherently existent being that we are craving for. There is no inherently existent object that we are, you know, uh, being able to obtain. And of course, the feelings that are around that object aren't inherently existent. If there's no inherent existence in any of the process, the result is that we should be letting go of any of these delusions. And of course, the ignorance that is driving all of it. So let's look at the commentary on this. This was the top of page 55 of Gyaltsab Je. It says, with regard to the teaching that psychic existence is reversed, if one realizes the non-existence of inherent feeling, when there is comprehension that there is no inherent person experiencing feeling, and that the experienced feeling also does not exist inherently, then at this time, having seen this circumstance of no inherent experience and inherent experiencer at the time, why would craving not be stopped? I think it's just the measure of whether we have really gotten this, have we grokked emptiness or not yet, is it dismantling the process by which we are engaged in craving. And if it isn't, well, then we haven't realized it deeply enough, even conceptually, to be able to undermine some of that. If we are continuing to buy into that, continuing to generate that craving for pleasurable feelings on the basis of our knowledge, even as superficial as it might be, of an inherently existent I not existing, an inherently existent feeling not existing, well, we obviously have to take it further if it hasn't dismantled that. We need to go deeper in terms of our understanding of emptiness. So continues and says, the craving wishing to attain happiness and the craving wishing to be separated from suffering are induced through the force of true grasping. That's the root again. The root of all of our problems is the the grasping at inherent existence, true existence, from which all of our states of mind arise. They're all contaminated in that way. Even our virtuous states of mind currently are together with some level of ignorance because we haven't realized emptiness to a greater degree to undermine that. So I did want to share one little verse that comes actually from Nagarjuna. I think it's from Precious Garland, that is very similar to this. So again, just so you know, Precious Garland is divided into 4 chapters, each of them 100 verses. So you see different references. Sometimes it says chapter 4, verse 63, which is actually verse 363. Depending upon what version you have, you may have different references to the same verse. This is a translation from Jeffrey Hopkins. Thus, attachment to meeting with pleasure and attachment to separating from pain are to be abandoned because they do not exist inherently. Thereby, those who see thus are liberated. So if we're not even liberated to some degree in our day-to-day life by this awareness, then once more we do have to deepen our understanding, because we shouldn't be having these cravings and attachment if we really see the nature of things. So now we go on to a third part of this. So we refuted that the nature of feelings is inherently existent, that the cause is inherently existent, meaning contact and everything behind that. Now we refute that the focal object exists inherently. There's only 2 lines for this. Even though they are seen or touched due to a nature similar to a dream or illusion. This is actually in the way it's put together in this translation by Ziggy. It's actually kind of part of the remaining part of the verse. So in our text, in Gyaltsab Je, it says, whether seen or felt, it is due to its dream-like illusory nature. So the idea here is that objects are seen or touched, but those objects are like a dream. They have illusory nature. Again, similar to a dream. We're not saying that they are dreams or that they are illusions, but we're saying that they have that quality. So this is from Minyak Kunzang Sonam's Brilliant Torch, which I'm going to quote from for this. We won't do Gyaltsabje's commentary. He says, "We shall now demonstrate that the objects which induce feelings, such as sights and sounds, have no inherent existence." You know, the beautiful music that we hear, the music that we can't stand, the beautiful visual forms that we love to enjoy, and then those things that we find ugly and hideous. You know, none of those objects exist inherently. All objects which give rise to feeling, forms seen by the eye consciousness, tactile objects felt by the body consciousness, and so on, it should say, not so no, do not exist in the way they appear. They themselves are unreal and deceptive, like dreams or magical illusions. So how could the feelings which these perceptual conditions cause truly exist? A deceptively existing object cannot give rise to something that is truly existent. This shows that if the object is not real, it is impossible for the subject to be real. Again, you know, the object is being targeted here, and we have many objects that induce the variety of feelings. This is what we are spending our day with, usually, is trying to get at those objects that induce all those wonderful feelings, the food we like to eat and the music we like to hear and the delightful things that we like to be around, and we do everything we can to avoid what is unpleasant. But those objects don't exist inherently. They are part of the equation too, as we saw, because they're one of the things that aggregate. So to say that we get some sort of inherently existent feeling on the basis of an inherently existent object would also be false. It's not just the contact that is not inherently existent, but also the objects that we experience through contact. They too lack inherent existence. So then we go on to the final section of this, refuting that the object possessor exists inherently. This, of course, is the subjective awareness of feelings, the consciousness. So it's kind of interesting. We've talked about the feelings themselves that arise. We talked about the cause of contact. We talked about the objects that are being known, the object possessor or consciousness that is occurring at that time. And of course, we haven't really refuted the inherent existence of sense powers, sense spheres, but they too lack any inherent existence. Them as well being part of a causal process and having their own causes and conditions. So here we have a few verses. We have first these two lines, the remainder of verse 99. Because they are produced simultaneously with the mind, feelings are not seen by it. So let's look at the commentary for this that comes again from Minyak Kunsung Sonam's Brilliant Torch. Next, we show that the subject of feeling does not exist inherently. If the feeling is simultaneous with the experiencing mind, which is what Shantideva was putting forth in these two lines, it cannot be truly perceived or experienced by the mind. Because if these two are the object to be experienced and the experiencer, they should be causally related. You know, but you can't have a causal relationship if things are inherently existent. If we say that my mind is experiencing the feeling of pleasure right now, then I have to say that there's a causal process for that. The feeling is being known by my mind. Well, again, they have to have some sort of a relationship. They can't be inherently existent, because then they would be utterly independent. They wouldn't have any sort of rising together in any way that we see them having a conventional existence. Conventionally, our feelings are experienced by the mind, without a doubt. However, if these two were inherently existent, they could not be causally related, because they would be two distinct substances occurring simultaneously. And being, I inserted here, inherently different, this wasn't in the translation, they would be unrelated. But this is the case. Things can be different, right? You know, our feeling is different than the consciousness knowing that feeling, the consciousness in which that feeling is arising. We delineate the five aggregates. One of them is feeling, meaning that mental factor, and the fifth one is consciousness, which is the bucket in which these mental factors are operating. Now, they're not utterly different, completely inherently different, or else they couldn't have any relationship. But they arise within the same mind and have similar substance and all the various things that we talk about in the course on minds and mental factors. That's because, once more, they do have a causal relationship. Yeah. or even a natural relationship in terms of them arising within the same mind. Any type of relationship they have belies their being inherently existent, because inherent existence would entail things being utterly independent on their own, would not be able to arise together or have any sort of causal process. So I decided to share a little bit of Geshe Jompo Gyaltsen's commentary. He's from Nalanda Monastery, I believe, who I've referenced his commentary a few times in chapter 9. When feeling and consciousness, that are two different things, this was their bracketed information they put in the published transcripts, exist inherently, they should be inherently different. If they are inherently different, they are unrelatedly other. Therefore, one could not relate to the other. In general, it is not the case that two phenomena of different substantial entities could not connect, since they can connect as cause and effect, such as a seed and a sprout, right? Those are different, but they're not inherently different. But here we speak about two phenomena existing inherently. Two phenomena that are different and inherently existent would be inherently different and therefore unrelated. And it's just taking the consequences. That's why this is called the consequence school, the Prasangika school, is because we always look at the consequences of our false thinking. If things did exist in the way that we believe them to, they actually couldn't have any causal relationship whatsoever. So then we go on to the next verse in this section about the object possessors, the subjective awarenesses. And it says, also, due to being produced before or after them, it would remember them but not experience them. So we just looked at the consequence of them being simultaneous if they were inherently existent, the consciousness and the feeling. Now we look at if it was produced before or after them, it would remember them but not experience them. And they do not experience their own natures, nor are they experienced by others. So let's look at, again, same commentary I've been referring to, Brilliant Torch, to see what that says. Again, I apologize for doing this because I know you have Gyaltsab in front of you, but you will get these slides and you can read through, and maybe you won't agree that this is a better commentary, but I sometimes find this commentary to be really quite nice. And I mentioned previously, this is the one His Holiness is referring to occasionally in his book, Practicing Wisdom. The consciousness which occurs before the feeling does not experience that feeling because the feeling has not yet arisen. And the consciousness which occurs afterwards may remember the feeling, but does not experience it because the feeling which is experienced has already ceased to be. So this is kind of interesting because I don't think he's necessarily in this argument going towards the ultimate so much as the conventional, because we see that if in the first one in particular, if consciousness comes before the feeling, well, how can we have a consciousness experiencing pleasure before the pleasurable feeling has occurred? That's obviously not conventionally possible. And if we think that they're inherently existent, then it would be even more impossible. But then the second one is actually what happens to some degree, because a feeling does occur, and we can say there's a consciousness that on the basis of that feeling can know that that feeling has arisen. But if it's inherently existent in this case, it cannot experience it because the feeling which is experienced has already ceased to be, because it has already come and gone. It doesn't have an ability then to act in any sort of causal way for that consciousness to arise. And in short, the last two lines, feeling cannot experience itself, as is proven by the refutation of the self-aware mind. We call these self-cognizers or self-cognizing awareness. The idea being that we've already disproved that some of the lower schools hold to, that there could be a level of awareness that is the validator of the awareness that is knowing that feeling. So they can't be experienced in that moment by themselves, by a self-aware mind. Neither can it be experienced by some other feeler. Because if there were some other inherently existent feeler, that feeler would necessarily be distinct from and unrelated to the feeling. So it's kind of interesting. You go back and forth between these sorts of conventional refutations and ultimate refutations. But recall that we went through this whole refutation of the self-cognizing awareness because we needed to show that there was nothing that was kind of acting as a validation with regard to the grasping at inherent existence and so on, and kind of giving rise to that sort of valid cognition. So again, this is we're just about done with feeling, but we're not quite there yet. Lots of little angles that are being explored by Shantideva in this last part. So there is no one who feels, no inherently existent feeler or experiencer. Hence, feelings are not reality, meaning they're not inherently existent. Thus, due to this, what damage is there to this collection that is devoid of a self? So let's look at how this is explained by, actually, we're going to go to our commentary for this. So here we're at towards the bottom of page 55. And it's interesting. Oftentimes, Venerable Fedor seems to put them in relation to the verses, but verse 101 actually starts with the second to last paragraph, the third line up, where it says, not only does that producing the feeling not exist inherently, but there is absolutely no inherently existent experiencer of feeling. This was already refuted at the time of refuting the self of person, right? Because it's the person who we can say is the experiencer of the feeling that is arising when the consciousness comes together with the sense power and has a contact with an object. All of that coming together, we have an experiencer, the person who is experiencing. Well, they don't exist inherently because we already disproved that they exist inherently. And it says, then, just as feeling does not exist as suchness, how should the collection of aggregates that lack an inherently existing self be benefited by happiness and harmed by suffering? Once more, we come to the same conclusion. There's no inherently existent feeling, no inherently existent person to experience an inherently existent feeling. We refute inherent existence at every level. Then, once more, all of the energy we put into trying to grasp at and obtain all those pleasurable feelings and push away all the unpleasant ones is all for naught, because we're doing it for a false sense of self and with a false belief in the inherent existence of those experiences. There is no inherently existent suffering. It is suitable to meditate on the close placement of mindfulness on feeling that lacks inherent existence. So again, this is the Bodhisattva's meditation in particular, to see that feelings are completely lacking inherent existence. I do want to share one little bit from Abbot Dakpa Gyaltsen's commentary, and he actually quotes Tsongkhapa. This is his sort of term he gives to referring to Lama Tsongkhapa. Thus the great Yongzen Tamje Khenpa says, in this way, one investigates and then analyzes the entity of feelings and the causes of feelings. This refers to taking as the basis the mode of appearance that is the object of refutation, in which feeling appears to exist by way of its own entity and is adhered to as so, and analyzing through reasoning, as we've done in this section. So what he's highlighting here is that the analysis is done on the basis of the object of negation, the object that we are trying to refute, which is the inherent existence that appears to us, as I've talked about. That is due to the imprint of ignorance on our minds that we have that false appearance, and then the inherent existence that we are then grasping to actively with our mind of ignorance. That is what needs to be refuted, and that's what we need to be always keeping in mind throughout this analysis. It is inappropriate, Tsongkhapa continues, to perform such analysis as to whether the object, sense power, and primary consciousness meet or not without the mode of appearance that is the object of refutation dawning as an object of the mind. In other words, all what I explained earlier, about the three coming together and all of that, we don't want to analyze that just on a conventional level, because that does happen, and we don't want to refute that. We want to refute that it happens inherently. For if one were to analyze in this manner, mere conventionalities would be harmed, whereby not only will ascertainment of the view not be produced, even dependently arising appearances would be damaged. We would damage the nature of conventional things, the conventional truth, by not clearly understanding what the object of negation is. Hence, it is very important to know thus the mode of analysis through reasoning, by having contacted the object of refutation. So I want to talk about this just a little bit, because Lama Zopa Rinpoche often emphasizes this. He says, if we go searching for the merely imputed feeling or the merely imputed I or the merely imputed body or whatever it is we're analyzing, you won't find that either, right? Because it's merely imputed, but it's not working with the object of negation, and it could lead to a nihilistic view. Because then we think that not even that merely imputed I exists, but the merely imputed I doesn't mean that there is something findable, and we don't need to go looking for it as an object of refutation then. Therefore, we look for the inherently existent I, the inherently existent feeling. And we come to the understanding after having refuted that, that the only way that the I can exist, that the feelings can exist, that the body can exist, is through being merely imputed. You don't want to go chasing after refuting that, because there's no purpose in refuting that. That's not our misconception. In fact, that's a correct conception. That's what we actually need to arrive at on the basis of a full understanding of dependent arising, which we're going to be looking at in this next little section after we get through the close placements of mindfulness. So hopefully that's clear, but again, we'll have a chance for questions at the end if that isn't. Mind and phenomena are the last of the four close placements, and we see phenomena only has a couple of lines, but we have a few verses for mind. Let's look at those. We have two outlines. The first one is showing that the mental consciousness does not exist inherently. The second one is showing that the five sense consciousnesses do not exist inherently, because they do have, again, different processes, different ways of working, and so we do need to refute them in slightly different ways, but neither of them exist inherently, neither of those groups. The mentality, this is another word for mental consciousness, does not abide in the sense powers, not in forms and so forth, nor amidst them. A mind is not inner, not outer, and it is also not found somewhere else. So this idea of kind of existing, the mentality, the mental consciousness, or the raw consciousness somewhere, existing somewhere in the sense powers, it is kind of strange. They talk about mental consciousness here, but they end up talking about these sense powers. There is a sixth sense power, which is specific to mental consciousness, but it is said to be the previous moment of consciousness, whatever that was. That's what empowers a mental consciousness to arise, because we don't have a physical sense power with regard to our mental consciousness. But nonetheless, it's kind of refuting that this mental consciousness could abide in any of these various places. What we do see as we go through this, and we have already seen it, is that to some degree we keep following a similar type of pattern in terms of the analysis here, which is we see that there's a kind of two options. Is it completely identical in terms of finding that inherently existent I or body or whatever on on its basis? Or is it completely different? Is it something that is completely away from that, which would mean that it is inherently, other, different, and wouldn't have any relationship at all? This analysis gets repeated again and again in this whole first section, and then we're going to have some new analyses that will be introduced in the next part of Shantideva's text. But essentially, this is the basic format as we go saying, okay, well, where do I find this inherently existent mind? Does it exist in the sense powers? Is it in the forms that are perceived by that consciousness? Nor is it amidst them, just somewhere in the, the forest there hanging out? A mind is not inner, not outer, and we also can't find it to be somewhere else, something completely different. So let's look at Gyaltsab Je here. So this is page 56. It says, mind does not exist inherently because it does not abide inherently on the six sense powers. So he includes in there the mental sense power that I just described. It does not abide inherently on the six objects of form, sound, sense, taste, tactile sensations, and objects of mental consciousness. Usually we say everything is an object of mental consciousness in a sense that it can all be known by mental consciousness, especially when we talk about the mind of a Buddha, but we, of course, in our mental consciousness can know many, many objects. And it also does not abide in between these two or on the collection of these two. So again, we don't find it abiding, in some sort of inherent way. It's what arises on the basis of a variety of factors and so on. Remember the sevenfold analysis of the chariot as explained in the introduction to the middle way. So I debated as to whether I should go into more detail on this, and I decided to go ahead and go for it. I know I've got limited time to teach this text, but I thought it was a very important thing to introduce you to if you hadn't studied the sevenfold analysis that Chandrakirti puts forward in his text Madhyamakavatara, but also to know the fivefold analysis that it comes from. And we've been mostly looking at what we call the fourfold analysis when we talked about the person, which was essentially identifying the object of negation, determining where that inherently existent I might be, and it would be either it's the same as or different from, just like I was explaining those two main options. And then we go looking, is it the same as the aggregates, the basis for the person? Do we find that inherently existent I to exist in reality among the aggregates, as part of the aggregates, as an individual aggregate? And then we get to the fourth step, which is something completely different. We can say that always these analyses are they come down to those two options, because there's really only two options. It's a dichotomy. Either something is the same as or it's different from. Is there a third option if it exists? No, that's what we saw in that second step of the fourfold analysis, right? These are the only two options. But these analyses were put together by Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti for the reasoning that we do have different shades or flavors of these that happen in our minds that are not identical to that sort of concept. In fact, it is said that the innate mind that is grasping at inherent existence doesn't hold the aggregates to be the I, for example. Nonetheless, if the I did exist inherently, it would have to be among the aggregates or apart from the aggregates. That's the reality of it. So we have to see how do we see this I? What is the nature of this I in relationship to the aggregates and so on? This is where this is mostly used. I know we're in the section on mind, and we can use the same sort of format for any of these phenomena. But I'm going to go back and talk about it in relationship to the I, because I think it's probably the most common way that we go into these analyses. So the very first one that came about was Nagarjuna's fivefold analysis in terms of, I guess the fourfold analysis is kind of the predecessor to some degree. I don't know which one was taught first by who, but when we look at this, we see that these are actually the different options. In a sense, we have to first identify the object of negation, and we can agree that, yes, it's either same or different, but we see these iterations. These are 5 iterations of either similarity or difference. So neither the aggregates, meaning the same as the aggregates, nor different from the aggregates, which of course is pretty straightforward. Those two are fine. Those are our normal options. The aggregates are also not in him. This is referring to an analysis of the Tathagata, the Buddha. Nor is the Buddha in the aggregates. This is another type of relationship where there is a form of difference, but it has to do with are the aggregates in the Buddha, or is the Buddha in the aggregates, kind of covering the aggregates? Also, the Tathagata, the Buddha, does not possess the aggregates. We can also have a feeling of possession, right? So what is the Tathagata? How do we find an inherently existent Tathagata? We don't. The Buddha does not exist inherently. So let's look at these 5 using Jeffrey Hopkins' emptiness yoga. And I realize, again, I'm going a little off track here tonight, but I hope that you find it useful. If you search for the one gone thus, that is the Tathagata, in these 5 ways, you will realize there is no one gone thus there to be found under such analysis. The most marvelous of all beings, the Supreme Person, is not findable either. Because we've been mostly looking at ourselves. We're not Tathagatas yet, we're not Buddhas yet, but even the Buddha cannot be found under this analysis. That's what Nagarjuna does in that chapter of fundamental wisdom. So the text that Jeffrey Hopkins working with in that emptiness yoga, that says 3 positions, the 2 of mutual dependence and the 1 of possession are included in the 2 positions of sameness and difference. So Nagarjuna said, the one gone thus is not the aggregates, nor is he other than the aggregates. These are the first 2 positions, right? Sameness and difference. We just saw that. In regard to the phenomenon that is designated and the basis of designation, Tathagata and the aggregates of the Tathagata. Then he said, the aggregates are not in him, the Tathagata, nor is the Tathagata in the aggregates. These are 2 positions of mutual dependence. The one gone thus depending on the aggregates, and the aggregates depending on the one gone thus. So let's look at this in more detail, some other analogies for how we might work with that idea. In one way, Jeffrey Hopkins says, the aggregates are like a forest, and the person is like a lion in the forest. This is the person depending on the aggregates, because the lion in the forest needs the forest to kind of reside in. The person and the aggregates are different, just as the forest is a collection of trees and the lion is an animal somewhere among those trees, but not a part of them. In the other way, the person can be like snow that pervades the forest and extends beyond it, kind of covering the whole forest. The forest is in the snow and in a sense depends on the snow, when we talk about a snow-covered forest. This is the aggregates depending on the self, the I. There's kind of like the I covering the aggregates. But it obviously is distinct still because snow is distinct from the forest. This depend is more like is in or is on. For instance, you can imagine that your hand is an entity pervading its parts, right? So then we have two possibilities. Is it just a little bit bigger, enveloping all the fingers and so on, which depend on it? Or is it just a little bit inside the parts that make up the hand and thus dependent on those parts? We saw something similar, right, when we looked at the body in Shantideva's refutation of the inherent existence of the body. Where does this hand reside? Is it something that covers the entire basis for the hand, or is a little bit of hand in each little part, in each little, bit of each finger and so on? And thus, in a way, again, dependent on those parts because they are all parts that make up the totality of the hand. A lion in a forest or a forest in snow are things that are radically different from each other. Reasonably, once there is dependence, there must be two things. That is, if the person depends on the aggregates, it has to be different from the aggregates, right? In this presentation, again, of inherent existence, because everything that does arise in dependence, that is how things exist conventionally. But in terms of if they are, dependent in this way, like snow on a forest, like a lion in the forest, and so on, then we do have them being different, distinct. They have to have some of that quality. However, they may not appear to differ as much as a lion in a forest. It may be more that the person is the space pervading the whole of the forest, and the aggregates are the forest, the aggregates in the person, right? Anyway, this is worth thinking about and actually using the fivefold analysis to kind of get at these subtler points of how our ignorance can be operative. Or to reverse it and exemplify the person in the aggregates, it may be more like a person in a tent, right? There's somebody abiding in here inside the aggregates. These examples, even though they are exaggerated, are very helpful for catching the sense of self that we're trying to refute, the sense of an inherently existent self. Again, has a flavor of difference, and we often say that that's an acquired conception. It's not something that we have innately. But we can see that we do have that through the force of false learnings and various things that we have been influenced by in our world and so on. Now, the two positions of dependence we just talked about then can be included in the position that the aggregates and the person are different. Indeed, if the person is inside the aggregates, you should be able to take the person out and identify a person separate from the aggregates, right? So we have 5 positions so far that were mentioned at the beginning. The first 4 we've looked at, same, different. 2 positions of dependence, which we just said were both different. And now we look at 1 of possession. The 2, because remember the Nagarjuna's verse said also the Tathagata does not possess the aggregates. The 2 positions of dependence, as I said, are included in the position that the Tathagata, the one gone thus, and the aggregates that are the basis of designation, one gone thus, are different. So that's already kind of covering, again, those first 4. That the one gone thus possesses the aggregates is included in both the positions of sameness and difference, because there are 2 types of possession, either within sameness of entity or within difference of entity. So let's look at the 2 examples here. A Tathagata could possess the aggregates in a way that Devadatta possesses a cow, right? This is a position of otherness. The person and the aggregates are different entities, just like Devadatta is not his cow, and his cow is not Devadatta. Or a one gone thus could possess the aggregates in the way that a tree possesses its core, a position that the person and the aggregates are one entity. Okay, so actually I've even heard this being referred to in other texts as like Devadatta possessing his ear. So the ear is part of the continuum of Devadatta in the way that the core is part of the continuum of the tree. And we can say that's a form of possession, right? I have 2 ears. I have 2 eyes. So he says this is a profound analysis of have. I have a body. I have a mind. Well, who is this possessor? Is this inherently existent possessor existing as something different? or as something similar. And here the idea is the sameness, that the mind and the body that are part of the basis of the person can be seen as being possessed by the person. So to summarize, we had 2 points that were an analysis of sameness. The person is not inherently the same as the aggregates. That was the first position that Nagarjuna set forward. And then I put it as 5a. I think it could be 5b based on just the explanation we went through, but it was the person does not inherently possess the aggregates within sameness of entity. Those are the only 2 that are flavors of sameness. But then we have 4 of difference. The person is not inherently different from the aggregates. Person does not inherently depend on the aggregates. The aggregates do not inherently depend on the person. Remember, those 2 had to do with the forest and the lion and the snow. And 5b, the person does not inherently possess the aggregates within difference of entity, like Devadatta possessing a cow. Okay. Thus, the 5 positions still can be reduced to 2. So why bother with 5? This is what Jangya says. However, in consideration of the modes of conception in which this false view of the transitory collection, which once more is our ignorance grasping at the inherent existence of the I and the mind, the possessor nature of this I, that this is how it operates. 5 positions are set out in the 10th and 22nd chapters of Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way because of this, because our ignorance is very tricky, has very many different modes of manifesting. So the false view of a transitory collection is our conception of our own inherent existence. And if we were merely doing a technical analysis for the sake of making a chart of the unfindable self that we could paste up on a wall, we could use just the positions of sameness and difference and dispense with the rest. However, there are many facets to the positions of sameness and difference in terms of the way in which the false view of the transitory collection works. Nagarjuna teaches these reasonings not for the sake of debate or merely in order to set up a beautiful philosophical system, which it is, obviously, but for meditation. It's so that we can go in there and actually see, what are my false conceptions around the nature of this I? How am I grasping it as inherently existent? Does it have that flavor of the same as the aggregates? Does it have a flavor of being different? So that we can actually use these analyses in a very effective way to undermine the variety of manifestations of our ignorance. If this teaching were not for meditation, he says, there would be no reason to give 5 positions. Some of them will attract your mind more than others. The elaboration of 5 positions draws out the significance more than just the 2 positions of sameness and difference. So he says for him, sameness and difference is usually too short. The analysis that you do in the 4-point analysis with just those 2 options, sameness or difference, cannot feel like it's in-depth enough. It's not getting broad enough in terms of the way our ignorance is operating. Whereas the 5-fold analysis opens it up, and the 7-fold analysis does so even more. It tells me more about what is involved in the 2 positions of sameness and difference. Okay. So let's look at the 7-fold analysis, which was actually what was mentioned. And the reason why I had to go in the 5-fold analysis was to give you the background for the 7-fold. Chandrakirti followed Nagarjuna, and he decided to elaborate on this. And he used the idea of a chariot, but a self or the mind or feelings or the body or anything else that exists can be analyzed in a similar way. I've given them numbers on the basis of what we called the first 5. And then we have the last 2, which are 6 and 7. So a chariot, and let's use the word car because we don't have chariots anymore, maybe in movies, but a car is not asserted to be other than its parts. So, it's not completely different than its parts. So you have a car over here and the parts of the car are somewhere else, nor is it non-other, nor are the parts identical to the car in an inherent way. It also does not possess them. The car does not possess the parts of the car. It is not in the parts, and the parts are not in it. It is not the mere collection of its parts, nor is it their shape. Again, Chandrakirti added these 2 because he felt that there were also other ways that our ignorance is manifesting in believing that the collection of the parts is the object that we are looking at. and holding to be inherently existent. But we once more don't see that the collection of the parts can be identical to the whole, the phenomenon that is designated to it. We already refuted that last week, right? I think it was last week or maybe the week before. And the idea being that once more, that which is the basis, the collection of parts that is designated, that cannot be the designated object. But also, once more, a collection is multiple. Collection of parts. I mean, that implies at least two parts, right? So then do you have two cars? And because you have two parts, and of course you have many, many parts to a car, but how many cars do you have then if it's the equivalent to the mere collection of its parts? Nor is it their shape. That sounds kind of strange to say, but nonetheless, we do identify things a lot by shape in the physical world. So the visual consciousness, it sees a particular shape and then identifies that as being that. And of course, when we assemble all these collection of parts, they assemble into a particular shape. And with cars, we know that to some degree. You can drive down the road and we go, oh, there goes a Subaru, and oh, there goes a BMW, and there, because there's different styles to the shapes of those cars. And so we then often identify the shape with the object. The self and the aggregates are similar. All 7 of these could be applied to the I that is imputed on the aggregates, and that analysis of whether there is sameness or difference in this variety of ways. So let's look at how those spell out. Analysis of sameness. Well, the first 2 were the same we saw with regard to Nagarjuna's, that the person is not inherently the same as the aggregates, the basic position of sameness. Then that 5a that had to do with possession, that the person does not inherently possess the aggregates within sameness of entity. And then the last 2 that had to do with collection and shape, the person is not the collection of the aggregates, and the person is not the shape of the aggregates. Okay, those are all sameness. So that kind of elaborates on sameness. We can get really juicy when we actually do the full analysis with 7 points. Difference is the same. There's nothing I need to comment on this because it's what I just went through a few slides ago. Positions 2, 3, 4, and then the second one of 5. Okay. Let me take a drink of water. I feel like I've been talking a lot tonight. My throat's getting a little dry. Okay. So we are working our way again through this section that had to do with showing that mental consciousness does not exist inherently. And so the reference there to these different analyses was to say that you can do the same analysis with any of these objects, because it's again boils down to sameness or difference. But with various objects, we might have a different sense of how that object exists inherently in terms of these different flavors that were talked about by Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti. So again, hopefully you can use that in your meditation. I didn't get a meditation out for last week. I kind of apologize. I was teaching this weekend for the center down in Brazil, and I just didn't really have much time to do much of anything. So anyway, but let's go on to verse 103, a second verse in this section. It is not the body. The mind is not the body. The mind is not other. It is not mixed with it, nor is it at all separate from it, nor is it not, it is not in the slightest. Therefore, a sentient being is a natural nirvana. Just it's kind of again, pointing to the fact that we talk about natural nirvana, we mean that it is naturally empty, empty of inherent existence. This is the nature of the mind. This is the nature of all phenomena, even emptiness itself. So here on page 56, Gyaltsab says, the mind also does not abide inherently in the internally elaborated person, labeled by the non-Buddhists, nor on the outer hands and other limbs, and it cannot be found to abide inherently in another way apart from inside and outside. It is not the body or truly something else other than the body. The mind is not mixed with the body, and it also does not abide as some inherent object apart from the body. Because it does not exist inherently in the slightest way, the emptiness of inherent existence of the mind is naturally gone beyond sorrow. So natural nirvana is actually technically it's a what's the word, a nominal division of nirvana. Nirvana itself always refers to a state of cessation where you have a full cessation of the afflictive obscurations. And then, of course, for a Buddha, you have the state of non-abiding nirvana, where they have abandoned all of the obscurations in the mind and are not abiding in solitary peace, and they are not abiding in samsara. But we have within nirvana, usually we talk about a nirvana with remainder, a nirvana without remainder. Maybe I don't need to go into all of that detail. But a natural nirvana is technically not a nirvana. It's just referring to the fact that everything is naturally empty of inherent existence. And that way, it's pacified, because nirvana essentially means the pacification of our own minds. And in this way, we can say phenomena are pacified of any sort of stain of inherent existence. They've never had that stain. It's just we have imputed that stain onto them. You know? Again, our minds have the stain of the misconception of all of that, but our minds aren't stained by inherent existence. They never have had inherent existence, but we falsely believe our minds to be inherently existent. So in this way, we can say that they have naturally gone beyond sorrow. They have that natural nirvana, that natural emptiness. So maybe that's enough on that. I don't know. This was an analysis for mental consciousness. Now we go on to sense consciousness, which all 5 of our sense consciousnesses are going to be refuted as having any inherent existence. And this is divided into a couple of different temporal things, just as we saw earlier with feelings. If the consciousness existed before the object of knowing, through observing what would it be produced? This is the same thing we saw with regard to the object earlier. How can you have the consciousness existing before the object that it's knowing? You know, we have to, if the object is going to be known, it has to act as a cause for consciousness. It has to come before the consciousness, not after the consciousness. So in terms of the commentary from Abbot Dr. Gyaltsen, I'm using his commentary now. If the sense consciousness existed before the object of knowing, the object that it is knowing, through observing what would it be produced? For the observed object condition did not precede it. We always again have to have the object being known prior to the consciousness arising, because the consciousness depends upon that outer condition of the object, as well as, of course, the sense power in order to be empowered to know it. And that gives rise then to that next moment of knowing that color or shape or whatever the case it is. If the consciousness and the object of knowing are simultaneous, through observing what would it be produced? And here it's particularly relevant with regard to inherently existent as simultaneous. So here we look at the commentary from Abbot Dr. Gyaltsen. It says, if the consciousness and the object of knowing are simultaneous, through observing what would it be produced? For one, if the sense consciousness has not been produced, then it cannot be produced, since the observed object condition has not been produced. So again, if they are simultaneous, then we do still run into the temporal problem, even conventionally. But it kind of, again, has its own entity and can't really act as something that produces a sensory consciousness at the time. The observed object condition, which would have exist simultaneous with that mind, didn't exist prior to it. So you don't have anything that acts in that temporal way to induce the consciousness knowing it. And 2, if the observed object condition has been produced, then since the consciousness has already been produced, there's no need for it to be produced. Sounds like a little bit of a mind twist on this, but the idea once more is that if the observed object has been produced already at that time, then the consciousness has already been produced because it's simultaneous with it. So there's no need for it to be produced because it already arose from its previous causes, which would have been the observed object condition prior to that. And everything does work in a temporal way. When we talk about these 3 conditions that come together in contact, again, what we are talking about is the consciousness that is empowered to know a particular object. But they say in Prasangika Madhyamaka in particular that the object and the sense power that is receiving that always are going to exist prior to the next moment of consciousness that induces the awareness of that. Because otherwise you don't have a causal process going on in terms of that object and being known by the sense power and then producing the consciousness knowing it. And the simultaneous thing couldn't arise because of the consequences we just looked at. But moreover, again, if they exist inherently, then there's no relationship that even can be talked about. And that's what we're going to go into in the last option. The third option is the normal way we talk about it, that the consciousness arises after the object. And it too cannot happen if there's inherent existence. It can happen naturally because it does happen all the time. As long as we talk about conventional existence and things being merely imputed, not inherently existent, no problem. So this is the first two lines of verse 105. Well then, if it exists after the object of knowing, from what is consciousness produced at that time? Let's look at how this is spelled out. Well then, if the sense consciousness exists after the object of knowing, from what is the sense consciousness inherently produced at that time? For this is incorrect, because again, inherent production of consciousness cannot occur, because even though it does happen conventionally, that it is preceded by the object and then gives rise to the consciousness knowing that object, it can't do so inherently. So Minyak Konsang Sonam says in regard to this, I'm just using his commentary too because I thought it was nice to have a contrast between these. How do we make this refutation? We refute true existence by ascertaining what is meant by this kind of origination. What is meant by inherent origination? Is the consciousness produced, one, by the previous instant where the visual form has already been disintegrated, or two, by the instant where the form has not yet disintegrated? Okay. Was that Minyak? No, that was Abbot Dr. Gyaltsen. Okay, so we do have two kinds of options that we're going to be looked at in regard to a deeper investigation of this. Is consciousness in moment B produced by the previous instant where the visual form has already disintegrated? Or is it produced by the instant where the form has not yet disintegrated? In other words, you're going to have two different possibilities here, that prior object has ceased, or the object that is being known has not yet disintegrated. The first case is unacceptable. Although the disintegrated visual form is, according to this tradition, an existent entity, as it is not the form source, it cannot produce the I consciousness because it's disintegrated, right? It's disintegrated, it's no longer the form source. If it could, then a burnt seed would be able to produce a sprout. But a burnt seed has no capacity to do that because it is extinct. It's not it's not fertile. It won't produce a sprout. So in a same sense, a form source that has disintegrated can't produce an I consciousness in the next moment because it doesn't exist itself. Okay, so that's again a deeper investigation into this, even in terms of conventionality. If the consciousness is produced by the non-disintegrated form, is there two options? An interval in time between them? So if you have something that has not yet disintegrated, then is there an interval before the consciousness arises, or is there not an interval? So if there is, then it would be impossible for the caused consciousness to actually be produced by the perceptual condition, the visual form. Because you have a gap, you don't have any ability for it to then be the cause, because the cause has to immediately precede the consciousness that knows that object. So a gap doesn't work, because a gap would then belie it being a direct cause of that moment of consciousness. And if there is no interval at all, the previous and subsequent instance of time would end up getting mixed and become one, in which case it would be impossible for there to be a preceding cause and a succeeding result. This consequence in particular has to do with its inherent existence, because if you have an inherently existent cause that has not yet ceased, then you couldn't have an inherently existent consciousness arising in the next moment, because they would essentially become one. Because it's impossible for you to have a preceding cause and a succeeding result, because cause and result, once more, are contradicted by inherent existence. So then they have to become identical. It's a weird consequence, but anyway, I hope I'm doing a good enough job of explaining it. That's why I'm relying upon these other masters and their way of writing about it. But cause and result, once more, are not upheld in terms of an inherently existent cause with an inherently existent result. So if the moment of that particular phenomenon that is being known, say that the object of blue, again, it hasn't disintegrated and it is arising without an interval, well then, because it's inherently existent, it can't give rise to an inherently existent consciousness knowing blue. And even if only one of them was inherently existent, you still couldn't have that. But, obviously inherent existence, we have to think about what are the consequences of inherent existence. I find this kind of outrageous myself, when I do think about this, because I don't think that logically we would agree to a lot of these things, right? We would say, well, I believe in the inherent existence of the I, or else I wouldn't be in the predicament I'm in. But do I think that the I really exists with these same consequences? That we go through in this tradition, that we, kind of say, well, but if it really existed that way, it would be this and it would be that. I don't know that we take it to that logical conclusion, but that's the importance of seeing the logical conclusions of those things and seeing the consequences of holding the view that we hold. And of course, undermining it through these techniques of analyses. So I think I've gone through all of this section now, a little bit more. This is a strange little quote, but anyway, I'm sharing it. If each moment in time had two parts, one connecting and the other non-connecting, it would be divisible. And if analyzed by neither one nor many reasoning, it would be impossible to establish it as truly existent. I'm not sure I get the full meaning of why this was used in there, and I don't know why I even included it in my little presentation tonight. But I think the idea is, again, that if you do start looking at this and saying, well, what would be a way that you could have an inherently existent cause give rise to an inherently existent result? Well, maybe you have some ability for them to connect, and yet recognizing that in their inherent existence, they would not connect. Then there's a divisibility, and then you wouldn't find them in the end to exist inherently. You can't find, I don't know. I'm not making a lot of sense of this one myself, so I'm not sure I should say anything more because I don't think it's in a lot of the other commentaries. I checked the other commentaries and I was like, well, that's not there. Maybe I should leave it out. But this was how he talked about it, and then went on to say this is Geshe Jumpo Gyaltsen. Maybe I shouldn't share this, but maybe I should. I don't know. I do feel like this is a rather dense section, so let's go through this. The consciousness, Geshe Jumpo Gyaltsen says, the consciousness comes from a previous cause, in general referring to the observed object condition. The consciousness is the result, and when arising, it is due to a cause. So, does it arise from a cause that has ceased or from a cause that has not ceased? So this is that third option, that you have it preceding the cause, the object preceding the consciousness knowing the object. So we have the two possibilities. Is it from a cause that has ceased or from a cause that has not ceased? When within the context of positing inherent existence, one says that an inherently existent sprout arises from an inherently existent seed, one obviously gets into trouble. At the time of the sprout, the seed has inherently ceased. It is a burnt seed and therefore completely destroyed. To have a sprout arising from that is not possible, right? Because there's some continuity of the seed into the sprout. If it inherently ceased, if it was utterly non-existent at that time, you'd never be able to get a sprout from it, because it's like getting a sprout from a burnt seed. Okay, therefore, it has to be the second option. The result should arise from a cause that has not ceased or ended, and that still abides. But in this case, we saw earlier with Minyak Kunsang Sonams, there are again two options. Either first, there's a gap in between the cause and the result, or secondly, there's no gap. All right. If there is a gap between cause and result, if in our example, there's a gap between seed and sprout, then there's no direct production. This means it is not the direct cause producing the result. And there should be another direct cause in between that produces the result, the sprout, or else the sprout can't arise. So if there's a gap between this cause of the seed and the result of the sprout, then you have to produce, it has to be produced from somewhere else, because that gap is going to get in the way of that seed actually producing that sprout. The second option is that there is no gap in between the cause and result. In this case, the cause and result have to be the same, like a whole thing existing within a whole thing. In the example, the seed existing in the sprout, as mentioned before. And that's also impossible, right? Because we do see with our eyes that the seed has ceased to be there, and what is known as a sprout is now there. It's not utterly gone. It's not inherently gone, because then it would be like a burnt seed, as we saw earlier. But nonetheless, it doesn't continue to exist. You cannot have it producing things in that way if inherent existence is involved, because otherwise, again, they would have to be identical if there wasn't some sort of a gap. Okay, that's a lot of words. Let's go to conclude this section, and this will be all we probably have time for tonight. This is meditating on the close placements of phenomena, and there's only 2 lines for it. In that way, it is not that the production of all phenomena will be realized. So we can never realize the inherent production of phenomena. We can never find, things to exist truly, and that's because nothing exists inherently. All phenomena could be subject to the same analysis, and you wouldn't find them, no matter what sort of levels and iterations you went to. So, I want to wait and share that after I go through Gyaltsabje's commentary, page 57. In the way explained earlier, the generation of all phenomena is not realized as inherently existent because, as it is taught in the sutra requested by the superior, inexhaustible, discriminating wisdom, one should realize all compounded and uncompounded phenomena as non-inherently existent. So it's not really giving us a whole lot more information other than saying that in this way, all phenomena can be seen as lacking inherent existence because they too will not withstand analysis. When we look for an inherently existent table, or we look for an inherently existent emptiness, anything that is a phenomenon, whether it's created through causes and conditions, compounded, or whether it's uncompounded, not arising from causes and conditions, permanent, it too cannot be found. So Geshe Jumpo Gyaltsen says, when the Prasangika Madhyamikas check the reality of phenomena, whether they exist inherently or not, whether they exist conventionally or not, and so on, they start their analysis in relation to impermanent or other-powered phenomena. This is what we've done, right? In this analysis, the body is a caused phenomenon. It's impermanent. So are feelings. So is the mind. So is the I. These are the phenomena we work with because it is a little bit easier to see them in relationship to the causes and conditions that give rise to them, and to make these sorts of refutations. Impermanent phenomena are easier to investigate than permanent phenomena, since they are produced in dependence on causes and conditions. There's a cause and effect relationship. After seeing the final reality of impermanent phenomena, we apply that understanding to permanent phenomena that are more difficult to analyze, whether they exist inherently or not. Therefore, we start with analyzing the impermanent phenomena, and having investigated them, move on to the permanent phenomena. And then His Holiness says, generally, the argument used to establish the substantial reality of phenomena is that things and events have function. So the realists, the schools beneath Prasangika Madhyamika, say things have to have substantial reality, have to exist inherently. Why? Because they function. Where specific conditions give rise to certain things and particular circumstances lead to particular events. That's the nature of impermanent phenomena. They are caused by various things, and they are the results of those things, therefore. And so he says, so we assume that things and events must be real, that they must have substantial reality because of this process. But this principle of functionality is the key premise that realists use in asserting the independent existence of things and events. This is what they hold on to. Because things function, they function as causes giving rise to results. They function within their own ability to perform their own, specific functions. Functionality of the causal process being operating means that they must have inherent existence. But of course, the Prasangika Madhyamikas say the exact opposite. If the Madhyamaka is successful in negating the intrinsic existence of these functional entities, then, as Nagarjuna put it in stanzas on the middle fundamental wisdom of the middle way, it becomes easier to negate the intrinsic existence of more abstract entities, such as space and time or emptiness. Time is actually an interesting one he put in here. Time is an impermanent phenomenon. It's actually what's called a non-associated compositional factor. It's not form and it's not consciousness, but it is an impermanent phenomenon, right? Time is changing all the time. So nonetheless, as I was saying earlier, the Madhyamaka school actually uses the idea of causality, that level of dependent arising, to show even at that degree, we can't have inherent existence. We've been doing that throughout this whole analysis, right? Because there are causes and conditions to feeling arising. It can't exist inherently. Because there are causes and conditions to mental states arising. They can't exist inherently. Causal processes fly right in the face of any concept of inherent existence. Okay, that was a lot of words tonight, and you probably have to spend some time digesting all of this, but I don't know if there was anything else that I can share tonight. Questions? I like blown everybody away or something. Jennifer had her little hand up. Please, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Gandan. This is very helpful. When you mentioned natural nirvana, you got me thinking, is there a proof or a consequential argument as to why nirvana is peace and why it is blissful?
I don't know that I've heard anything along those lines that is actually, again, the natural state of our minds is empty of inherent existence. And that's why, of course, nirvana can be attained, is because the stains in the mind are not inherently existent. The mind itself isn't inherently stained by them, and so on. So, but in terms of sort of argument that speaks to the pacification that we would experience and how that is kind of set out and reasoned, as well as, again, the blissful feeling. I guess blissful is also kind of it's a strange word in some ways, because again, we wouldn't say that there is a feeling that we know that we would be experiencing then, because the feeling kind of transcends what we have currently experienced. Because everything that we've had has been contaminated, it's been together with our own minds, that it's going to be very different from the happiness that we know and are grasping at, and so on. So the state of peace, I don't know.
Yeah, I remember having a debate with a non-Buddhist about this, because he was very much into sense pleasure as being the ultimate level of happiness, and of course it's impermanent and it's not always reliable, but it's the zenith. And it's like, okay, well, let's say that there's something better than that, which is the cessation of delusion. But then what is that experience, and how does one actually prove that exists on, if you don't rely on faith alone, or, a teacher saying so, or scripture. So
yeah, I think, again, I've never heard of reasoning that sort of proves it. And it is kind of hard, because once more, all the experiences we have, if you were to tell somebody, well, what is it like to sort of have a mind that is not conceptually active, that is sort of in a state of resting in some sort of peaceful existence? Well, I mean, the closest thing perhaps we have is when we go to sleep, maybe. I don't know. Because even when you talk about like the bliss that you might experience on a quiet evening, watching a beautiful sunset or something, it's so conditioned, right? Because it's the environment that you're in, and the sunset going, down, whatever, all the various things that induce that feeling. And those things, once more, are not a true source of pleasure, as beautiful as they are, and they don't really get at it. So it gets to be hard to imagine what that must be like, to have a mind that's pacified of those disturbing
yeah.
emotions.
And his argument was, well, would I rather have let's say I'm sleeping, or sort of a peaceful mind, or would I
Yeah.
rather, in a way, using relativity and saying,
Yeah.
you enjoy the good so much more because of the bad.
I understand. Yeah.
And so I didn't know how to answer that person. So
Yeah, because I don't think that it becomes flatlined. I don't think that, certainly they talk about the bliss of Buddhahood. I think it is an experience that it transcends our ordinary experiences. So it's really hard to convey that to anybody, because again, all we have is our ordinary experiences. So I don't know, that's a tough one. Maybe again, that's not the best way to approach trying to, compel someone to have an interest in the Buddhist path, is because I think, again, that they will find that there's an inner happiness that develops that they can experience to some degree. It's not the freedom from the delusions, but it's the inner happiness they have from being a good person and having a bit more insight into the way the world works and everything, and being responsive to the world rather than so reactive all the time. Because I think on the Bodhisattva path, that's definitely a part of our bliss, is that we are able to be feeling a sense of self that goes way beyond our own limitations in terms of embracing all beings and so on. I don't know. This is my own approach to it. Maybe that's a better way to tackle it, is to say, the open-heartedness that we can feel when we are, totally in touch with the world, the suffering of the world, the desire that all beings be happy, and so on. Those feelings in the Mahayana are perhaps a little bit closer to it. When you talk about a sort of Hinayana Nirvana state of solitary peace, it gets to be very hard to relate that to something. I don't know.
Thank you.
Richard, did you have something? Thank you for the question, Jennifer.
No, just a point of information. You had
Oh.
put a question about up on where the verse was in His Holiness's
Oh, okay.
commentary, and it's page 125.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I've put some of these question marks in there because I don't have my hard copy of the books here. I took some books with me to my mom's, but I didn't take them all. All my Shantideva books would have been like a whole other suitcase, but but I do have some of them here. But that one is on my Kindle, and I can't tell the page number on my Kindle because it doesn't have the page references. So thank you, Richard. It was 125, you said? I'll put it in the file then. All right. Any other questions from tonight? Yes, Fernando, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Don, and everyone else. So I have this doubt. From what I understand is that inherent existent phenomena, we cannot interact with it because we're empty of inherent existence. So would it mean that inherent existent phenomena do not exist? Or is it just that we cannot interact with it and then we do not know if they exist or not? Or has the Buddha said that inherent existent phenomena do not exist? And then when I mention inherent existent phenomena, I think that it's something that do not change. And so if there is something that do not change, then it's permanent. And then I think about the space, which is a permanent, like a permanent phenomena. And then we do interact with that type of phenomena.
So you bring up a number of good points, Fernando. Again, the Buddha said that there are no inherently existent phenomena whatsoever, no inherently existent I, no inherently existent, colors, shapes, whatever. Nothing exists inherently. The consequence that you point to of things not changing if they were inherently existent, that doesn't mean that if things don't change, therefore they are inherently existent. It means that that would be a consequence of inherent existence that would come along for the ride. But it's not the definition of inherent existence. Inherent existence doesn't mean something that is unchanging, because then emptiness would be inherently existent, because emptiness actually doesn't change moment by moment. The emptiness of dawn is the same now as it is the next moment, while dawn is this changing phenomenon. The emptiness of dawn is a negative, and it's a constant because it's always the lack of inherent existence of dawn, the lack of inherent existence of dawn, the lack of inherent existence of dawn. It never changes. It's a constant. So we can't say that this consequence, that inherently existent phenomena wouldn't change, then we use it as an equivalent, that then things that don't change are inherently existent. It's just a consequence that comes along, especially and only when we're looking at phenomena that do change. The fact that phenomena do change flies in the face of inherent existence, because inherent existence would imply that unchangeability, that things have to have that constancy and stay the same, because they're not dependent upon causes and conditions. They don't have any, influence from other factors. They would have that constant, continual thing. But those phenomena that we do have, such as emptiness, that don't change, also lack inherent existence. That's where you have to go to the other levels of dependent arising. Next week, we're going to start off this next section that begins to touch a little more on dependent arising. But remember, there are 3 levels of dependent arising. The first is only applicable to impermanent phenomena, and that's that all conditioned things depend upon their causes and conditions, right? That's emptiness doesn't depend upon causes and conditions, so it doesn't fit into that category. But the other 2 levels of dependent arising do apply to all phenomena, to impermanent and permanent phenomena, which is that all phenomena depend upon their parts. And you might say, well, what are the parts of emptiness? Well, there are temporal parts to emptiness, right? The emptiness of dawn now, the emptiness of dawn then, the next emptiness of dawn. There are temporal parts to emptiness. That is how we define the emptiness of dawn. The emptiness of dawn isn't one of those parts. The emptiness of dawn depends upon all of those parts of the continuum of dawn. Okay, then we have the final one, which is dependence upon mere imputation, mere designation. And of course, that's where we want to arrive at through all of these analyses, is to see that what we are mostly talking about is, do things have an ability to stand on their own? And we see that they don't, because they're merely designated by a conceiving mind. That emptiness itself even is conceived of on the basis of the quality of lacking inherent existence. Therefore, it arises in dependence upon a label, emptiness, that we give to that quality of lacking inherent existence. So again, when we get into these other levels of dependent arising, we see that there are other ways of approaching this. It just, the consequence of working with things being unchanging if they were inherently existent really only applies to impermanent phenomena, because that would be a consequence for them. But those phenomena that don't change moment by moment, we can see their lack of inherent existence in the other ways, as I just pointed out. So emptiness is merely imputed, and emptiness is dependent upon its parts. But emptiness doesn't have causes and conditions, and it is an unchanging phenomenon, but that doesn't stop it from lacking inherent existence, because it's a dependent arising in the other ways. Does that make some sense, Fernando?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I need to study a bit more, but yes.
Yeah. We'll talk more about dependent arising next week. Like I said, we begin to touch on that topic. There is a separate section of a couple of verses where the reasoning of dependent arising is set out in kind of a brief way. But it's said to be the most powerful reasoning because it upholds how things actually do exist. Because the Buddha never said, you don't exist, we don't exist, the Buddhahood doesn't exist, nothing exists. Buddha never said that. And if he said it, of course, it was in a context where the implication was lacking in, and it doesn't exist inherently. This is the qualification. This is what we're going to begin with next week, is that qualification always has to be there. We have to understand, and we even saw that earlier tonight, that's the object of refutation. If we refute mere existence, then we've fallen into a nihilistic bent. We haven't upheld the world of the conventional truth. We've realized ultimate truth, but taken it too far so that it negates conventional truth. That's why we started this whole chapter with the two truths, with the recognition that there are two natures, if you will, in relationship to everything that exists. What is found by conventional valid cognition, which is in the end merely imputed, merely designated on a basis, and what is found with ultimate analysis through ultimate cognition, which is the emptiness, the lack of inherent existence of that merely imputed phenomenon. And these two coexist with every phenomenon. The emptiness of dawn will exist as long as dawn exists, and then it goes out of existence. But while these two phenomena are intermingled with regard to everything, the ultimate truth, its ultimate nature, and the conventional nature. So we'll talk more about that next week, but thank you for that question too. All right, let's call it a night. I don't know, I'm going to have a hard time putting questions together for the homework. I don't want to make you bend your minds too much, but I think it is important that we digest these teachings somewhat. Was there anything else in the chat box? No, I don't think so. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and do our prayers together. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. And we make prayers for our precious gurus as we recite these two prayers for these two teachers. I think that we're also creating the causes for all spiritual guides in our tradition, as well as other traditions, to have good health, long lives, to always be a part of this world so that we and others can benefit from their guiding presence. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Scroll down a little. For you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Then let's dedicate for those beings that we're holding in our hearts, again, understanding that their suffering that we are thinking about is caused by all the various factors we're talking about. They're clinging to their feelings as inherently existent. They're clinging to themselves as inherently existent. They're committing actions on the basis of this misconception, this view of the transitory collection. All these beings are suffering right now, and we should absolutely want an end to it. So we can dedicate our merit right now for the relief of suffering of all these beings, those that we know that are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died. I think that it brings about a complete cessation also of the causes of their suffering and helps them to attain all the causes of true peace and happiness, complete enlightenment. And may all beings attain that perfected state through what we have done here tonight. Okay, so just a reminder again that we have one more class before a little extended break on October 11th, as well as the remaining Mondays of October. We won't have class because I'll be on retreat, and there's also a holiday in there. But anyway, in November, we will resume. So we have one more class. Do come back next Monday, but then we'll be back in November after that and go through the entire month of November, 5 Mondays there. And finish the chapter, hopefully, as well as chapter 10. So, all right, everyone, be well. Have a good week.
Thank you so much.